In the digital age, our devices tell a story, sometimes more clearly than we ever could. Where we go, when we move, what we search, who we contact. The data is always writing, and in the case of the Idaho 4 murders, cell phone data has become one of the most central pieces of the narrative being constructed by the state. According to the affidavit released after Bryan Kohberger's arrest, his cell phone data shows a troubling pattern. A series of late-night trips into the area surrounding 1122 King Road, the home where the 4 students were murdered. On 12 occasions before the night of the killings, Kohberger's phone reportedly pinged near the house. Prosecutors suggest this wasn't coincidence. They argue it shows pre-offense surveillance, that he was stalking the victims, studying the layout, preparing. And on the night of the murders, November the 13th, 2022, Kohberger's phone reportedly went silent between 2:47 a.m. and 4:48 a.m. A window of nearly 2 hours. A gap that aligns perfectly with the believed time of the murders. And when his phone reconnects to the network, it begins traveling south on Highway 95, away from the scene. This timeline forms the backbone of the prosecution's narrative. It is used to show presence, planning, and flight. But what does it actually prove? That question is more complex than it appears, because cell phone data, like all digital evidence, is only as good as the context in which it's understood, and in this case, the margin of error, the interpretation of silence, and the assumptions being drawn all deserve a closer look. Cell phone pings don't show faces, they don't reveal intent, they don't prove action. They prove only one thing, that a device connected to a tower within a certain range at a certain time. And depending on how that signal is read, that range can stretch for miles. This chapter isn't about dismissing the evidence, it's about understanding it. Because when a case is built on data, when location becomes implication, we have to ask how reliable that evidence really is, and whether it tells the whole story. Before we follow the digital trail deeper, we have to ask the most important question of all. Where does the evidence actually lead? And how far can we follow it before the signal fades? Before we can interpret what cell phone data might mean in this case, we need to understand how it works, and more importantly, how it doesn't. When a phone is in use, whether it's making a call, sending a message, or using mobile data, it connects to the nearest available cell tower. This connection is referred to as a ping, and it's recorded by the cellular service provider. These records can then be obtained by law enforcement through a court order or warrant, and used to trace a person's movements over time. But here's where things get complicated. Cell tower pings do not provide GPS-level precision. Instead, they show which tower, or sector of a tower, a phone connected to at a given time. The size of that coverage area can vary dramatically based on terrain, weather, tower congestion, and whether the phone is inside a building or moving. In urban areas with dense networks, a cell tower ping might place a phone within a few hundred meters, but in rural or suburban settings, like Moscow, Idaho, the radius of that ping could extend several miles. That means someone could be in the vicinity of a house, or on the road nearby, or simply passing through the general area. In Bryan Kohberger's case, law enforcement used cell phone records to show his device was in the area of 1122 King Road on a number of occasions prior to the murders. These pings were not precise enough to place him at the house, only near it. That distinction is critical. Being in the area is not the same as being at the scene. It's also important to understand the role of triangulation. Sometimes, when multiple towers pick up a signal from the same phone, investigators can use the strength of those signals to estimate a more specific location, a process called trilateration. But the affidavit does not specify whether this technique was used in Kohberger's case, or whether the pings were single tower readings. That matters, because single tower pings carry far more ambiguity. In previous cases, courts have acknowledged both the utility and the limits of the cell tower evidence. In the United States versus Hill, a federal court stated that cell site data provides general location, not a specific address. And in the State versus Johnson, another court ruled that while such evidence can suggest a person was near a crime scene, it cannot conclusively prove that they were at that specific location. In short, cell tower data is helpful, but it's not definitive. It tells us something, but not everything. And in a case as serious as this one, where the location, timing, and movements of the suspect are central to the narrative, understanding the limit of that technology is not just important, it's essential. Because when a case relies on signal strength and tower coverage, we have to remember what the phone says and where the person actually was are not always the same. According to the arrest affidavit filed in December 2022, cell phone records linked to Bryan Kohberger's device showed that it had been in the area of 1122 King Road on at least 12 separate occasions prior to the night of the murders. Most of those visits occurred in the late evening or early morning hours. To prosecutors, this pattern appeared intentional. The suggestion was clear. These were not random trips through town. They were pre-offense behavior, consistent with stalking, planning, or casing the residence. But what does this pattern actually reveal? The affidavit does not include exact GPS coordinates or physical surveillance confirming where Kohberger himself was during these visits. It only establishes that a phone associated with him, one registered under his name and used consistently across multiple verified locations, was near the King Road neighborhood on multiple occasions between August and November 2022. Each of these pings placed the phone within the vicinity of the victim's residence, not at the house itself. And the term vicinity in cell tower analysis can mean anything from a few hundred yards to several miles, depending on network conditions, tower density, and geography. In Moscow, Idaho, a town with hills, trees, and relatively sparse cell infrastructure, the margin for location area can be significant. What stands out, however, is the repetition and timing. The visits weren't during class hours or peak daytime traffic. They happened late at night, consistently. That pattern is difficult to ignore, and for investigators, it raised questions about intent. Was Kohberger simply driving through the area for another reason, visiting someone else nearby, familiarizing himself with the layout of the neighborhood, or something else entirely? It's also worth noting that there had been no confirmed evidence that Kohberger had any personal, professional, or academic reason to be in that particular neighborhood. The University of Idaho, where the victims studied, is separate from the Washington State University, where Kohberger was pursuing his PhD in criminology. His home in Pullman, Washington, was approximately 10 miles away, a 15-minute drive, depending on conditions. In isolation, a single visit might be dismissed. Even 2 or 3 could be explained as passing through. But 12? To investigators, that repetition gave the data weight. Whether it proves guilt is another matter, but it strongly suggests deliberate presence. Still, a critical question remains. Was it Kohberger using the phone during each visit? And if so, was he specifically watching the house, or simply nearby? The affidavit draws a line between presence and purpose. The public must do the same, because while the phone's proximity is documented, its reason for being there is not. And in the absence of confession or video, the difference between surveillance and coincidence rests entirely in how the evidence is interpreted. By the early morning hours of November the 13th, 2022, 4 lives had been taken inside a quiet house on King Road. According to law enforcement, the killings occurred sometime between 4 and 4:25 a.m. It was in this exact window that cell phone data associated with Bryan Kohberger reportedly went dark. From 2:47 a.m. to 4:48 a.m., Kohberger's phone, the one allegedly linked to him through carrier records and account information, showed no activity. No calls, no texts, no data, no connections. To investigators, this gap wasn't just suspicious, it was potentially incriminating. The state argues that Kohberger intentionally turned his phone off or placed it in airplane mode to avoid tracking while committing the murders. And then, roughly 2 hours later, the phone reconnected to the cellular network, this time registering along Highway 95, traveling south, away from the crime scene. This detail forms a critical part of the prosecution's timeline. They frame the gap as a calculated act, a sign of intent, awareness, and concealment. In a case with no confession and no known eyewitnesses to the killings, the absence of a digital footprint becomes its own kind of evidence. But let's step back for a moment. A phone going dark is not, on its own, proof of criminal activity. Phones lose signal or they run out of battery. They're powered off, forgotten, dropped in glove compartments, or disabled for privacy. And while it's true that Kohberger's device was consistently active before and after this window, suggesting routine usage, the silence alone does not confirm where he was or what he was doing during those hours. There's also the matter of how the timeline is framed. The affidavit notes that at 2:42 a.m., Kohberger's phone was still connected to a tower near his residence in Pullman, Washington. By 4:48 a.m., it reconnected south of Moscow along a highway corridor. That gap, roughly 2 hours, aligns with the window during which the murders are believed to have occurred. But again, the data is circumstantial. The prosecution is inferring that movement occurred during that dark window, but without GPS data, surveillance footage of him leaving his home, or independent witnesses, it remains an inference. What's also important is that the device does resume communication afterward, not hidden, not discarded, not reset or factory wiped. It reconnects as if resuming its normal routine. To some that appears careless, inconsistent with the profile of someone who successfully committed a complex and violent act without leaving an obvious trail. To others, it appears calculated, the digital equivalent of surfacing for air after a silent plunge. In either view, the absence becomes a presence, the gap becomes a clue, but what it actually proves, if anything, remains open to interpretation. Because digital silence is just that, silent. And unless filled with corroborating evidence, it's not a confession, it's a question. By now, the cell phone timeline has become one of the prosecution's key pillars. The 12 late-night visits, the sudden silence the night of the murders, the reappearance hours later, moving south. It paints a picture, and for some, that picture suggests guilt. But here's the question that's harder to answer, and perhaps even harder to ignore. If this was such a meticulously executed crime, why bring a phone at all? From the outside, this attack appeared precise. No forced entry, 4 victims killed in rapid succession, no reported screams or DNA except for the knife sheath, and importantly, no eyewitness able to identify the killer. The person who did this, whoever they were, moved with speed and confidence. They avoided detection and left behind almost nothing. They seemed to know exactly what they were doing. So if the goal was to commit a perfect crime, a silent crime, why risk carrying the one device that could track your every move? And not just carry it, but bring your own phone, registered to your name and linked to your accounts. The same phone you'd been using for months, on a network with known tower connections and call logs. This isn't just a detail, it's a contradiction. Because if Bryan Kohberger was the killer, and if this crime really was the result of methodical planning, then the decision to bring his personal phone or to leave a digital trail before and after the crime is puzzling at best, especially when you consider his background. Kohberger was a PhD student in criminology. He studied criminal behavior. He understood forensic science. He wrote about criminal thought processes and post-offense decisions. He had even surveyed former offenders online to better understand how they avoided detection. This was not someone naive to digital evidence. This was someone immersed in it, which raises an uncomfortable question. Would a person with that level of knowledge make such a fundamental mistake? Would they carry their personal phone into a high-risk, high-stakes, premeditated homicide? Or would they leave it behind? Switch to airplane mode, use a burner phone, or better yet, use no phone at all. Because burner phones aren't hard to acquire. They're cheap, untraceable, disposable, and for someone going to the lengths of allegedly turning off their primary phone during a 2-hour window, you'd think the next logical step would be to use a secondary one, or none. So the question isn't just whether the data places Kohberger in the area, it's whether the presence of the phone itself makes sense within the theory that he was the killer. If the crime was the work of a careful, informed mind, a mind with detailed knowledge of how criminal investigations work, why leave behind the one thing that most reliably ties you to the scene? It's possible that the killer made a mistake, that in the fog of adrenaline and planning, this one detail was overlooked. It's also possible that the explanation is simpler, that the person connected to the phone was never where we think they were. In either case, the question remains, does the presence of that phone support the narrative we've been told, or quietly challenge it? Cell tower data gives us proximity, a general sense of movement, but not precision. That's why in many modern investigations, law enforcement turns to something more refined, something more invasive, more exact. It's called geofencing. Geofencing is a digital dragnet. Instead of starting with a suspect and looking for their phone activity, investigators draw a virtual boundary around a location, a house, a block, a parking lot, and then request a list of all devices that entered that space within a set time frame. It doesn't matter who owns the phone. It doesn't matter what they were doing. If their device crossed the virtual fence, their presence is logged. Google receives tens of thousands of these requests each year. They're known as reverse location warrants, and they've been used in cases ranging from arson to homicide. In the State versus Chattree in Virginia 2019, police used geofencing to identify suspects in a bank robbery. In the United States versus Zachary McCoy in Florida 2020, an innocent man learned he'd been surveilled when Google notified him that his data had been turned over to law enforcement. The tool is powerful, but it's also controversial because geofencing doesn't just collect data on suspects, it sweeps up everyone. Every jogger, every food delivery driver, every Uber passenger, every neighbor. In this case, the Idaho 4 murders, we still don't know whether a geofence warrant was issued. If it was, it hasn't been publicly disclosed in court records so far, but given the level of public scrutiny, the high stakes, and the lack of physical eyewitnesses, it seems unlikely that such a tool wasn't at least considered. Then there's another layer even closer to home, Wi-Fi data. If a killer passed near the victim's house and their phone's Wi-Fi function was active, it could have attempted to connect to their home network. Even a failed attempt would leave a record on the router's logs, identifying a MAC address, timestamp, and signal strength. To be clear, we don't know if investigators pulled those router logs. We don't know if a Ring camera, a neighbor's smart TV, or a home assistant device was scanned for digital echoes. But we do know that these tools exist, and in a case where seconds and meters matter, digital forensic specialists often work in layers. Tower pings, GPS records, Wi-Fi pings, Bluetooth overlaps, to build a complete picture of who was there and when. In any investigation involving cell phone data, there's an assumption that often goes unspoken, that the person who owns the phone is the same person who was carrying it. And in most cases, that assumption holds. People are rarely separated from their devices. Phones are extensions of our habits, our identity, our location. But in criminal investigations, especially those relying on digital evidence, that assumption can be misleading. Ownership does not guarantee possession, and possession does not guarantee presence. Let's look at Bryan Kohberger. The phone investigators tracked was subscribed in his name. It was used to connect to cell towers consistent with his known travel routes. It accessed Wi-Fi networks in Pullman. It moved between Washington and Idaho in a way that aligns with his routine. To law enforcement, this was enough to associate the phone and its activity with Kohberger himself. But here's the legal reality. A phone is not a fingerprint. It's not a DNA match. It is a proxy. And in rare but critical cases, it's possible, even plausible, that a phone may be carried, borrowed, forgotten, or manipulated by someone else. Defense attorneys have raised this point in other digital evidence cases. In the State versus Walker in Idaho 2017, the defendant's conviction was overturned when it was found that the phone used to place incriminating calls may have been accessible to others. In the case of the People versus Rivera in New York 2020, defense counsel successfully argued that a second person may have had access to a shared phone, raising doubt about who sent key messages. These are not everyday occurrences, but in high-stakes cases, they matter. In Kohberger's case, there is currently no public evidence to suggest that his phone was used by anyone else. No indication that it was reported stolen, or that a secondary user had access to his accounts, biometrics, or unlock credentials. But the burden in court isn't always to prove guilt. is to prove certainty, to close every door. So the question becomes, is the prosecution relying on a signal or on the man himself? Because if the phone was not in Kohberger's presence during those critical hours, then every ping, every gap, every connection belongs to someone else. And in a world where phones are traded, cloned, borrowed, or planted, however rare these situations may be, the ownership of a device is not enough on its own to prove guilt. It's a strong thread, but it still needs to be tied to the hand that held it. When a crime leaves few physical traces, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and no surveillance, investigators often turn to the one thing people rarely leave behind: their phones. But while cell phone data has become a cornerstone of modern forensic investigation, it is not without limits. In fact, courts across the United States have repeatedly warned about one particular danger: overstating its accuracy. Let's start with what's possible. Cell phone tower data, the kind most commonly used in cases like this, can show that a phone was connected to a particular tower at a particular time. Sometimes it can go further and indicate which sector of the tower was used, giving investigators a rough sense of the device's direction or distance. But even in optimal conditions, that range can span anywhere from half a mile to several miles, depending on the strength and angle of the tower's signal, the terrain, nearby structures, network traffic, or whether the phone was inside a moving vehicle or building. In rural areas or less populated areas, like much of the latter county, Idaho, the signal radius can be significantly larger than what most people imagine, making precise placement very difficult. In the United States versus Davis in 2015, the 11th Circuit Court emphasized that cell tower location data does not pinpoint a specific location, but rather places a person within a coverage zone that can stretch over a wide geographic area. Similarly, in the State versus Andrews in Maryland 2016, the court ruled that while cell phone evidence may be helpful, it cannot be considered definitive without corroboration. These cases reinforce a key point. Cell data is a tool, not a verdict. And that brings us back to the Idaho 4 case. The affidavit against Bryan Kohberger cites multiple instances in which his phone pinged in the area of the King Road residence, but it does not and cannot prove he was at the house. There's a difference. There's also the issue of data collection methods. The state appears to have relied primarily on carrier records, not GPS or real-time tracking. And these tower records, while admissible, are less precise than GPS logs pulled from apps, Google location history, or Wi-Fi router data. If those additional layers were accessed, they haven't yet been disclosed in the publicly available findings. This doesn't mean the data is invalid, only that it should be understood in proportion to its reliability. Because in a case where minutes and meters matter, where the difference between being inside a house or passing on a nearby road can mean the difference between innocence and guilt, accuracy is everything. And as powerful as digital forensics can be, it is still bound by the same rules as every other form of evidence. It must be tested, it must be challenged, and it must be understood in full context, not just in isolation. For those following the Idaho 4 case, the timeline seems to present a clear implication. Bryan Kohberger's phone was in the area, the victims were murdered that night, and there is no record of him being elsewhere. But here's the critical question, one that separates data from certainty and presence from prosecution. Is being in the area enough to prove involvement or even intent? In legal terms, presence at or near the scene of a crime, even suspicious presence, is not, by itself, sufficient to convict someone. Let's break that down. In the United States versus Castellanos in 2007, the court ruled that mere presence at the scene of a crime, without more, is insufficient to support a conviction. And in the case of the State versus Edison in Arizona 2006, the court affirmed that proximity and the time and place must be accompanied by additional behavior, motive, action, participation, to rise to the level of guilt. This principle exists for a reason. Because if presence alone were enough, how many innocent people would be swept into criminal cases simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Now let's return to Kohberger. The affidavit suggests his phone was in the area of King Road 12 times before the murders, and silent during the approximate time the killings occurred. That is undeniably suspicious. It raises questions. It suggests possible surveillance, planning, and evasion. But the data does not prove he was inside the house. It does not show him committing the crime. It does not capture motive, or method, or mindset. This is where the difference between circumstantial evidence and direct evidence becomes more important. Circumstantial evidence relies on inference. It says, because this happened, and that happened, we can reasonably conclude the following. Direct evidence, by contrast, is tangible. It shows something happened with clarity. A fingerprint, a surveillance video, a confession. In Kohberger's case, the cell phone data is circumstantial. Strong? Perhaps. Suggestive? Yes. But conclusive? Not on its own. This is why courts and juries are cautioned not to rely solely on digital footprints when assessing guilt. Because a device can move without intention. A signal can be logged without criminality. A person can be present without being responsible. And when the stakes involve 4 lives, the standard cannot be might have been. It must be beyond reasonable doubt. Presence can raise suspicion. It can justify an investigation. It can reopen the door. But it does not, in and of itself, close the case. Because being nearby is not the same as being guilty, and until all the gaps are filled, proximity is only part of the story. In cases built on silence, when no one speaks, no cameras roll, and the victims can't testify, we turn to what remains. We follow the pings, we trace the routes, we look for patterns in movement and gaps in time. But even in the most data-driven investigation, there are limits, boundaries. Because for all that cell phone evidence can suggest, there is a hard truth that remains. It can't tell us what a person was thinking. It can't show us what they were doing. And it can't prove, alone, that a crime was committed. When Bryan Kohberger's phone went dark between 2:47 and 4:48 a.m., we were left with a void. And into that void, we've poured meaning, possible intent, possible concealment, possible guilt. But the absence of a signal is not the presence of a motive. The fact that a device was in a certain place does not mean a person who owns it committed a crime. Phones do not capture intent. They do not explain why someone drove a certain route, or what they did when they stopped moving. Cell data can't tell us what was in someone's hands. It can't tell us what they saw. It can't prove rage, planning, or fear. And most importantly, it cannot, on its own, explain why. That's where context matters. Corroboration, other forms of evidence, witnesses, behavior, forensics. Because when you build a case on digital signals alone, you're not just telling a story, you're interpreting one that is always incomplete. The state will argue that Kohberger's digital trail is consistent with someone scouting, attacking, and escaping. The defense may argue it's a coincidence, a mistake, an incomplete picture. And for those of us trying to understand the truth that is fair, factual, and free of bias, we must remember this. Cell phone evidence is not a conclusion. It's a clue, a thread in a wider tapestry. And unless that thread is tied to motive, action, and identity, it remains what it is. A signal, not a confession. The digital trail can tell us where someone was, or at least where their phone was. It can reveal patterns, highlight absences, suggest intent, but data is only as powerful as its context, and context requires caution. In this episode, we've examined what cell phone evidence can and cannot tell us. We've looked at tower pings, gaps in connectivity, possible explanations, and the risks of assuming that presence is the same as guilt. We've also asked questions that may not have answers, at least not yet. Why would someone so well versed in criminology carry their own phone to the scene of a planned crime? Why bring a digital witness into a place where silence was essential? Maybe it was a mistake, or maybe there's more to this story than the signal reveals. As this case continues to unfold, What remains clear is that cell phone evidence alone won't give us the full picture. It's a piece, an important one, but it must be tested, not just trusted. That concludes part 7 of the Idaho 4, Theories Beyond the Official Narrative. If you found this episode thought-provoking, we invite you to like, comment, and subscribe to the Silent Casebook. In the next episode, we turn our attention to the most scrutinized and misunderstood piece of forensic evidence in the case: DNA. What was found and what wasn't, and what it might actually mean.